Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm a very hoarse Jane Harmon, H-O-A-R-S-E, Jane Harmon. But hey, I can't figure out why this happened to me. We know there's rain outside. We know that security is robust in this building, and we know more people will come, but this is streaming, and we are live on Twitter, so go at it. We expect a much bigger audience for a very important event. As I said, my name is Jane Harmon, not that Harmon. I have great respect for the company my late husband, Sidney, built and where its CEO, Dinesh Paliwal, has taken it, including the transition to become a Samsung company. The problems our panel will discuss today, bad guys exploiting vulnerabilities in technology we depend on, is something I really care about and spent 9 terms in Congress addressing. Today's panel, which is more than Harmon the company, it includes other automakers and very smart people, is called Security and the Connected Vehicle. We better learn about this, and we better solve the threats, or we're all going to suffer from what happens. As someone who is sure her car is more like a spaceship than an automobile, I drive a Tesla X, I'm thrilled to learn about the state of vehicle cybersecurity. As companies increasingly guide our transport, from cars to roads on which they drive, trust in the security of these systems will be critical. Lives are at stake, and the public needs to trust that the government and private sector are keeping safety at front of mind. This isn't usually the case for cyber threats. For profit reasons, cybersecurity is usually an afterthought. So maybe this can be a really good news story, and surely we need a few good news stories in our news cycle these days. Today you'll hear about what the mobility sector is doing, and it is organized and doing stuff to keep us safe from cyber threats in our vehicles and what's needed going forward. It's a big task, but we've got an impressive panel to walk us through it. Today's moderator is Roger Langto, Director of Automotive Connected Mobility at Strategy Analytics. Let me try that again. Automotive Connected Mobility. Does that fit on a business card? No.
More or less.
More or less. Maybe it's an acronym. At Strategy Analytics. Roger has nearly 3 decades of experience in the automotive industry with particular knowledge of the evolution of the connected car. He is joined by Yuval Weissglass of Harmon, where Yuval is Vice President for R&D of Automotive Cybersecurity. He founded a company called TowerSec in 2013, which Harmon bought in 2016, and before that served in Israel's Unit 8200, the elite hacking group in the Israeli Defense Forces, which I hear is today majority female. Is that true?
I don't know.
Well, if it is, it's better than it used to be. That's pretty good intel. I don't know where we got that. Faye Francie is Executive Director of the Automotive Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the group that works with car companies to make sure everyone has the latest cyber threat information. Faye spends every day making sure that the industry, from its cars to suppliers to the commercial sector, has what they need to keep security a priority. Harry Lightsey is Executive Director of Emerging Technologies Policy at GM. His background is in telecommunications, an integral part of the driving experience these days. And finally, Jeremy Spalding joins us from JMS Innovation and Strategy. He's an industrial engineer with a specialty in light technologies and has just written a white paper we are releasing today for anyone who wants to learn more about this topic. Look for it on the Wilson website. And finally, let me acknowledge Meg King, who once she hears me speak her name is going to hide. Where's Meg? In the back. Excuse me, who is the director of our Science and Technology Information Program at the Wilson Center, and who runs our Cyber Boot Camp. In case you missed it, the Wilson Center educates a bipartisan, bicameral group of staff to Capitol, to Congress, on how the internet works, how it can be hacked, which is too easily, and what are some strategies that actually can work to protect it, both in the private sector and the public sector. And we've educated now 250, Meg, how many? 250 staffers. That's a good start. And our hope is this will trickle up so that members who brag about the fact that they use flip phones will learn about the substance of the policy, and our legislative strategies, instead of being analog, will become digital, because this threat obviously is digital. So I want to thank Meg, and I want to thank Jake, who's all dressed up in the front row, for helping to put this panel together. And now I want to welcome Roger to educate all of us in what we need to do and what those who are best and brightest in the industry and in the consulting biz are doing to keep our mobile platforms, especially our cars, safe. Welcome, Roger.
Okay, thank you very much, Congressman Harman. Welcome this morning. We do have a distinguished panel with a broad range of expertise on this topic. I have a couple of slides to sort of set the table for our conversation today. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but perhaps to keep everybody focused and motivated to solve this problem, I do want to note, although I don't have these numbers in the presentation, that this is clearly a multi-billion-dollar opportunity to solve and a multi-billion-dollar problem confronting the automotive industry. So, but again, just some table setting, and I'm not going to talk about strategy analytics. You can figure out who we are. We're a consultancy, and we look at connected home and mobile devices, and we also have been looking at cars for a very long time. So the cybersecurity challenge is twofold. One is securing future vehicles, and the other is securing the fleet. And basically, cars from major automakers are getting basically into the connected car business and are de facto running fleets. There is a slight problem in that we're requiring people to pay a subscription today, which means there are a lot of cars with connections that aren't connected. We expect that to change over time, that every car will ultimately be connected. In some markets like Europe, the connection is mandated. But the challenge facing the industry is you can't solve this with bolt-on solutions. It's an organizational challenge. From the time you're designing the vehicle straight through the factory and delivery, and then the post-delivery ownership and servicing experience, there are many facets of solving vehicle security. These are the various attack surfaces. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but there are probably more here than you realize, including the head unit in your car. Could be an attack surface. It could just be the RDS TMC information for traffic and weather information. That is a point of a hack attack. The challenges and threats. Well, the reason why we got into this conversation in the first place as an industry is, and one shouldn't assume that car makers weren't trying to make vehicles secure. Of course they were making vehicles secure prior to this era that we've entered of cybersecurity hacks in cars. But when Chris Valasek and his colleague Miller hacked the Ford Escape and the Toyota Prius, what the message, if anybody watched that video, was that once car makers started introducing self-parking technology and vehicle connections, you had the ability to take remote control of a vehicle. And in fact, even you could say once we had anti-lock brakes, stability control, you're starting to create a control opportunity that is interesting to a hacker, let alone all the other potential risks. These are the various industry organizations, and I think the organizers of this event can make these slides available, so if you want to dig into the topic further yourself, you can, but I just want to make sure these resources, you're familiar with them, they're available. There's a variety of organizations all over the world trying to solve this problem with new standards, and regulatory authorities are trying to step in as well, especially in the context of trying to bring autonomous vehicles to market, where there's a clear recognition that we may have to require actually remote control of vehicles, which again changes the game if you're talking about controlling a vehicle that is going to otherwise control itself. Again, it's a global proposition, And then these are some of the solution providers. This slide is a little bit old, several months old. There are new providers entering the market almost every month. And so this opportunity is attracting a lot of attention, a lot of different approaches to solving the problem. And just as a final comment, even this week, there's always a new headline every week about some cybersecurity breach of some kind or another that has everybody's hair on fire and gets it's a good headline these days, drives clicks, right? So the latest one was big red flag, automakers' trade secrets exposed in data leak. So there was a supplier that somehow or other had all these files from their customers, automakers, and they were freely available online, all this confidential information from multiple automakers. And if you're at all familiar with the automotive industry, that's obviously a major no-no. And I think it was quickly corrected, but it was one of the suppliers that sort of alerted this tier 1 or tier 2 provider that, guys, you're exposing all of your customers' confidential information. So it's not just taking control of cars, it's also the impact of the design of vehicles. And so there are supply chain issues at stake and valuable IP in the industry. So without further ado, am I going to be advertising strategy analytics? Well, we'll just leave that up for now. Sorry about that. That was not my intent. So I'd like each of the panel members to sort of introduce themselves, what your organization does, and how you were brought to this topic. What sort of event or experience brought you to solving this problem. So Yuval.
Thanks. So Yuval Weisglas. I'm part of Harman. I've been doing cybersecurity for many years now. Started, at the military in Israel, and then served 11 years in the Israeli Security Agency. And I think, cyber challenge is something that you see in many domains, but I think it has some unique shapes when you come to look at cybersecurity with respect to automotive. And that's because of the cyber physical aspect that you've mentioned, where you have, on one hand, you have the cyber aspect where you have a car that is potentially connected to the world, but at the other side of it, you have computerized systems that are basically controlling the physical aspects of the car, and then that directly translates into safety. So as having hacking cars a long-time hobby of mine from other reasons, I've used to do this to kind of increase the horsepower. I used to have more hair and less children at that time. It was a unique opportunity for me to kind of explore that space where I bring, the hobby and the profession to one place. And back then we've started, TowerSec to kind of see what are the challenges in terms of security and how you could potentially find pragmatic solutions to solve it.
That's an interesting point that you make with regard to the fine line between hacking and hacking, enhancing the vehicle just for your own purposes as opposed to something malicious.
Right. But, even if you look at, the lighter type of hacking, obviously there's no malicious intent, behind, increasing the horsepower output of the engine. But eventually that means that somebody was able to circumvent a security feature that would, should have, originally restrict the ability to change the software of that engine control module. So that means that there's a security breach. Now it wasn't used maliciously, but it could be potentially used maliciously. So I found this, topic very exciting, cars and computers and the cyber physical challenge. And later we've joined Harman, and Harman is traditionally a very significant tier 1 supplier to the industry, doing infotainment systems, telematics, and other computerized systems. And I was able to kind of, see that transition from a very hardware-centric organization to a very software and services-centric organization, with the inclusion.
Well, let me ask you something. So your organization was relatively small, if you don't mind my saying so.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's growing very rapidly now, and I know you're consolidating
Not
your
Harman,
office.
you mean TowerSec
I'm
originally.
talking about TowerSec, yes, of course. And there were smaller ones, but yours was relatively small.
Yeah, also, Harman is quite small, compared to Samsung, so, it's all relative in height.
Right, right. But how was the decision made when you were getting started to go after automotive? I mean, was it clear that there was an opportunity, or, how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, I think, it's looking at the challenge, obviously there is a lot of challenge in around security for IT systems, but that was a very crowded space, with many solution providers on one hand. There are other security challenges in other areas, like, if you look at airplanes, if you look at, critical systems.
So you saw a blue ocean opportunity. Maybe.
It's not just a blue ocean. I think we've saw that there's a unique complexity to the supply chain of automotive that creates a unique challenge that is not there in some other areas. So for a mobile phone, vendor that is, producing a phone, it's very easy, or it's easier to have a full control of what you're putting inside, what chipset you're using, what software you're actually coding and putting inside. You have much more control over it. That obviously also changed, over time, and now you see a lot of, open source and third-party code going in. But when you look at cars, the way that the supply chain is made means that a lot of components are getting into the cars with very limited control of the OEM of that
multiple networks, multiple processors,
right.
Dozens of ECUs.
Right. Millions of lines of codes that came from different sources. So it's a very unique challenge to solve. And I think, initially I saw some, saying, yeah, you should telling, automotive OEMs, you should redesign the car to kind of mitigate those risks. And that's not realistic, right? To completely redesign the car. So I think what we found, exciting in that challenge is how you could make a significant impact on the overall security of the car, without completely redesigning it. So then, and then I was able to see that from
unless you're Tesla, right?
Well, from an outside perspective, that statement might look true, but there are still significant amount of components that are coming from the supply chain. So and then I got the opportunity to see that from a tier one supplier perspective when we joined Harman. So we came with the agenda of, okay, we're providing technology for the automotive industry to kind of mitigate that risk and eventually make the cars safer. But then we saw the challenges for an automotive tier one supplier to kind of transition, from an organization that was not handling security as a major topic to something that needs to be embedded in every step in your design, implementation, testing, and post-production phases.
So speaking of which, Faye, interestingly, I only learned just a little while ago that you took over the auto ISEC after some experience in a related industry, shall we say, that's already come to terms with this challenge. And I'm sure many people here have come to realize that almost every industry has an ISAC for solving these problems. What's your perspective on how you came to solving this and the progress that you've seen?
Yeah, so I did start in aviation. That's really where most of my career was spent. I was at the Boeing company. I worked on commercial aircraft, and I was in the network and cabin and network systems group. And of course, we saw the tsunami coming. We started to look at it. We had, of course, in our design, there's a lot of system redundancy that's built in as part of the engineering process. And of course, very focused on safety, as is the automotive industry. We recognized that there were some challenges early on, both from Airbus as well as Boeing. In fact, Airbus had the first E-enabled aircraft out there before our 787 hit. And
E-enabled?
E-enabled.
What does that mean?
Just meaning enablement. Connected.
Okay, all right.
More on the connected side. And we recognized that we did need to work together as an industry, across the industry, to really secure and to collaborate, because this is a huge threat. And there's so many different facets that we needed to work with the suppliers. There's about 10,000 suppliers on one airplane, as you know. And so the lines of code, believe it or not, are much less in aviation than they are in automotive, as Yuval has pointed out. So in a 787, it's about 35 million lines of code, and in a normal car today, it's over 1 million. plus and growing.
100.
Could be 100 million.
Yes.
100 million.
100 million and growing rapidly, I believe. So very different in that dynamic, but clearly still very similar industries with the CAN bus and ECUs and so forth.
But you've had to contend with, I think, some organic issues within the automotive industry community, because in the automotive industry, we think we're in the defense industry, and everybody protects their information very jealously, and Auto ISAC is saying, hey guys, you have to share. So how's that coming?
It's happening. We have 47 members today, and believe it or not, we are sharing. It is an unnatural act. It's not in our DNA to share openly with our competitors. And so there's a little bit of a style to it, if you will. Obviously, we do not share anything that would be considered intellectual property or architecture designs, et cetera. We really focus in on what is the particular threat or issue.
And what's the sharing pitch, basically? I mean, right? I mean, I'm sure you have to talk some of these guys in off the ledge and say, no, really, it's important.
Cybersecurity is an asymmetric threat that I think none of us have really recognized the impact and potential of this, because it is so dynamic, emerging, and asymmetric. And so in order to really thwart the threat, one must really work across a broader brush of sharing that information and collaborating. And by the way, the threat actors use the same tactics, techniques, and procedures to attack one industry, one company, to the next. And why do they do that? Because they share much better than we do in those tactics and procedures, and they are able to really dynamically do things telling them not to share, and they are able to really share a lot of what they do and attack multiple industries using very simple techniques, low cost, et cetera. So in order for us as an industry to safeguard our overall resiliency of the industry, we must work together. It's just an absolute.
Well, I was waiting for you to say it, but I'm going to have to make you say it. We're all sharing the same supply base, basically.
And most of us have very similar suppliers. It's amazing. I even see similar suppliers from aviation to automotive, some very large ones, in fact. So absolutely, the industry is really interconnected in that way.
And nobody here has to worry about flying.
No, they shouldn't worry about flying.
We don't need to believe those stories about planes controls being hacked from
Planes
the
aren't
air.
going to fall out of the sky.
But those stories are not true about planes being hacked in the air.
Certainly planes have been hacked in the air. There has been certainly folks that have made claims that they've been able to hack an in-flight infotainment system. There were some claims that they changed the flight controls. They did not. What they changed was the altitude on the moving map. So the actual controls were not taken over.
That was a high priority for me to clear up on this panel this morning. So I don't know about
I was
you,
very
but
worried about that
I
earlier.
fly a little bit. But so Harry, please introduce yourself and what you do and how you came to this conversation.
Yeah, so Harry Lights, the Emerging Technologies Policy. I joined General Motors in 2012, but General Motors actually pioneered the connected car model when it introduced OnStar in the late 1990s. Today, we probably have the largest connected car fleet in the world, over 13 million cars. And so that has been very important to GM for quite a while. And GM had resources thinking about cybersecurity for a long time now. In 2014, shortly after the NIST framework came out, GM took a long, hard look at that and decided that with all the changes going on in the vehicle as they were becoming more connected, and at the same time the spread of more ECUs and other electronic controls within the vehicle, to consolidate those resources into one vehicle cybersecurity organization. And so that was done in 2014 under the leadership of Jeff Massimilla. And he was reporting to the board on a regular basis and also to the CEO on a regular basis. More recently, we took another look at it and earlier this year reorganized again Jeff Massimillo was made the global cybersecurity officer of General Motors, and he is responsible for the vehicle, continues to be responsible for the vehicle, but also responsible for things like our manufacturing plants, which are heavily connected and have lots of robots working in them, and so safety is very important there. Also our IT back office system. So he has control over the entirety of GM because it was felt as very important for us to have a coordinated program across the entire organization. So that's going on. Now, of course, the automotive industry is making this tremendous pivot into vehicles that are avoiding crashes, can be much safer, and even into self-driving vehicles. And I would appreciate the shout out to Chris Velasic and Charlie Miller, because now GM acquired a company called Cruise Automation in 2016.
Yeah, they're working for you now.
They work for Cruise Automation and are thinking long and hard about cybersecurity for our self-driving vehicles. So we're glad to have them on board.
I suspect you have some thoughts with regard to Yuval's hobby of hacking and changing performance, because there was another story in the paper this week, also the Times, about how hobbyist hackers actually may be interfering with safety function, stability control and things like that.
Well, and that's a big concern, and I will tell you, I think there's been a very steep maturation in the industry in regard to our relationships with the researcher community. I was involved in the last triennial review of the Digital Millennial Copyright Act, where the industry voiced some concerns about researchers getting exemptions to would allow them to certainly expand their efforts with regard to automobiles. But shortly after that, in 2016, General Motors implemented the first coordinated disclosure program, which we still have today through the HackerOne portal, and we've begun to actively develop relationships with the researcher community to encourage them to look at our vehicles and to let us know if they find vulnerabilities, and we work with them through that. I think you'll see that has been very well received. We've received over 500 vulnerabilities that we've been able to confirm through that program, and I think we're looking for ways to expand that. So you might see some more about that in the near future.
So that's like a bounty program, isn't it?
Well, it's not strictly a bounty program today. It is it's a program where researchers can go online through the HackerOne portal and connect to GM in our cybersecurity organization and let them know. And then it's working with the researchers. If it's a confirmed vulnerability, we work with them. If they want attribution, we work through that. There's a relationship. They can be brought in under contract after they found the vulnerability to help us figure out how to solve that vulnerability. So there are various ways of working with it. It's not a bounty program per se, but that continues to mature as well.
By all means.
Well, just to share, that's called a vulnerability disclosure program, and it's a best practice that we highly endorse as the Auto ISAC. And in fact, next week we're actually going to be in Detroit with HackerOne, teaching our members how to stand one up. And GM has absolutely done a fabulous job. There are bounty programs such as BugCrowd can do those as well. We really encourage every company to do those, and also encourage anyone out there that really can't find the right person, or maybe they don't have company does not have a vulnerability program, that they could also come to the ISAC.
I'm resisting the urge to ask you all the questions on this panel since you are the expert, but go ahead, Harry.
No, I'll just say, that's the other thing, is that the General Motors was one of the founding members of the ISAC, and it was an effort that the industry really pulled together to make it happen, and the growth of the ISAC has been phenomenal. It's not only now includes almost all of the major automobile manufacturers that have cars on the road in the United States, But a lot of the tier one suppliers and through the supply chain, we have members of the telecommunications community that are definitely part of the ecosystem. And even now it's expanded into the heavy trucking industry. So they use a lot of the same suppliers as well. So the growth and the maturity in the ISAC is something that we applaud. Jeff Massimilla happens to be the chairman of the executive committee of the ISAC. So we're very involved in that growth, and we're very excited about it.
I think it's worth noting that GM brought Chris and Charlie in from the cold, because I think they were a little bit unpopular after the GPAC, and my perception of the GPAC, which is by now famous everywhere you go in the world, everybody knows, oh, GPAC, it's like Lehman Shock. Lehman Shock and GPAC people know in the industry. And because my perception was that they let FCA know that they had a problem, and my sense of it, I don't know this for a fact, that they were dissatisfied with the reaction that they got from FCA. So they said, this is my interpretation, okay, we'll show you how bad this vulnerability actually is. And so for GM to throw kind of a lifeline, they were at Uber briefly, but it clearly indicated that there was a lack of a procedure for how to respond to these kinds of notifications.
Yeah, I think at that time, the automotive industry was looking at cybersecurity, and it still is a very serious safety issue, and the I think immediate reaction was to kind of put the researcher community at arm's length, but I think the industry has moved beyond that, as I said, and through the ISAC and through others, we are working very hard on outreach to that community, because they're an incredible resource, frankly, in an area that is tremendously resource constrained. And I think that's another topic that we could really spend the rest of the day talking about is the need for folks that have the correct background in this area is incredible. And we certainly are looking for ways at General Motors and to get students channeled into the right courses and things so they can come out and help us in our efforts.
To its credit, FCA responded rapidly and very expensively to the problem. Maybe a little bit inappropriate initially. They sent out a postcard with a thumb drive on it, which is, I don't think any cybersecurity researcher would have advised that response, but they did respond right away. The reason why a car maker would hesitate to acknowledge this and respond is because it can be as much as $300 per car to bring them in and correct this. So it was hundreds of $1 million exposure. But do we have the procedures now in place yet? Have we defined what we do when we get a notification like this for cars that are already on the road?
I think that should go to an OEM.
Oh, okay.
Well, so
You're looking at me, but I think
well, General Motors, we certainly have, as part of our cybersecurity organization, we run tabletop exercises periodically, and we go through, what happens when, it's how do you discover an incident, how do you react, and as that escalates, how does your reaction escalate as well? So we run the whole organization through that. So incident response is a big part of it. I will say, the industry is working together through the ISAC to create a series of best practices, and I think one of those 7 is going to be incident response.
it is done, yeah. It's already out. Mhm.
So I know we've completed the majority of those. We still have a few left to work on. The other thing that we're doing is once those best practices have been assimilated by the members and they've had a chance to react to them, they're publicly released. And so a number of them have actually been publicly released, and through the ISAC website. They are an in-depth efforts. They are aspirational from the membership. I applaud the membership in reaching for something that is aspirational and not just kind of mundane. And then in publishing and making it public and kind of putting it out there and saying this is what we aspire to do in this area.
Yeah. What I would add to that, I think, if you look at the IT industry, it would typically, a big organization like an enterprise organization, it would typically take several months for somebody to discover that a system was hacked, and then several more months to actually remediate, to fix the problem and to recover from it. Now, we cannot imagine, a car being exposed to hacking and now taking, half a year or even more just to kind of realize that there's a problem and fixing it. So, while definitely some of the best practices are around, endorsing vulnerability disclosure and having incident response policies in place, we should also assume that our cars have vulnerabilities, and what's our ability to detect or know as soon as possible that somebody is trying to exploit a vulnerability. Maybe that vulnerability is not publicly known, so nobody told us that there's a vulnerability, but we actually see that somebody is trying to tamper with a car. So how do we shorten that path between being able to know that something happened to a specific car, to analyzing it and understanding the width of the problem, so how many cars are being exposed, understanding the depth of the problem, so what is the root cause, and then putting a remediation plan in
Well, this
place.
was what someone mentioned to me so I was talking to a GM executive some months ago in Detroit, and he was talking about how there are attempts happening, on a daily basis, and he indicated that they're already reporting that to the Auto ISAC. By the way, it just occurred to me, will Auto ISAC get to the point where it produces data on the sort of state of attempted intrusions, or is that not a role for Auto ISAC?
Well, we certainly are producing data within the membership, and we do share that data, and that's part of the information of learning what's happening out there. And actually, really, if you will, crowdsourcing across membership on how to mitigate these things, and that helps to the speed of analysis, et cetera, because the subject matter experts are residing in all of the companies that are doing automotive. So we really do try to support quick analysis and at least bring in the experts that we can. Now, with regards to how we go outside, we do have a community meeting that we invite anyone that's interested in automotive to join. And in that's a once a month sort of virtual town hall that we hold. And in that meeting, we do share what's trending at what we call the TLP green level. So it doesn't get into specifics, it doesn't get into company names. It says, hey, there is a key fob hack out there that's happening. This is what's going on in general. So we are sharing that through the community calls.
By the way, I'm going to ding you just a little bit. From the very beginning of Auto ISAC, it was only automakers,
Yes.
which I may have written a blog, forgive me, about the blind leading the blind, but you opened the doors very soon thereafter to the supplier community.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, initially there were 14 OEMs that came together that recognized, actually around the same time that the Miller Valsec Wired magazine was coming out, the OEMs were actually incorporating the Auto ISAC. At that time, I wasn't part of that at that time. Booz Allen Hamilton stood up the organization for the automakers, and they really wanted to understand what it meant and get their sort of collective act together. Then once they felt a little more comfortable, they invited the tier ones in, and now we've also invited in also the heavy vehicles. So we've just actually brought in all of the heavy U.S. manufacturers last week. In fact, was the first time they were all together, as well as fleets and carriers. So we've opened and broadened the aperture.
Yeah, so I imagine that membership's going to start.
We're about 47 today. When I joined, I think Tom and I were figuring this out this morning, about 27
Okay.
at the time.
Okay.
It's been about a year and a half.
All right,
Yeah, I
Jared.
think all of us would say, the ISAC has really grown and matured very rapidly and exceeded expectations. I think of certainly of one of our group, one of the original 14, and we're very proud of what the ISAC has been able to accomplish. But I think it speaks to the industry at General Motors, and I don't think we're unique among the major OEMs. That cybersecurity is identified as the number two risk to the corporation. We have a board, a committee of our board that is the cybersecurity committee that receives regular reports on the state of cybersecurity in General Motors, and so. It is a very important topic.
Okay, Jeremy, you're our white paper author. What's your perspective on this? And you have a little bit of a GM pedigree as well, but please introduce yourself and your perspective.
I do. Thanks, Roger. My name's Jeremy Spalding, and I'm approaching this industry a little bit differently than these guys. My background is in human factors engineering and really human interaction with systems. And so I spent about 15 years across about 5 different industries, really exploring R&D and emerging technologies development for automotive and wireless technologies, enterprise software, lighting technologies, and also medical. And really looking at this gives you an appreciation for not only how people interact with systems, but what is on the horizon and what's coming up next, and starting to approach this from a systems engineering perspective. And now I'm with, in addition to JMS Innovation and Strategy, I'm also with a group called, or an organization called Auto Nebula Group. And so taking this knowledge and applying it to Auto Nebula is a global accelerator, global venture accelerator and a venture fund. So designed to help the mobility industry really advance in terms of its own technological offerings, but then also help it advance in terms of its, really helping the startup industry expand this whole industry as it moves forward. All of these convergence points are coming together, and it's all going to happen, relatively quick. We've heard anywhere from 5 years to 20 years, but, stepping back and looking at this, a lot of stuff is going to happen in a relatively short amount of time. And one of our big focuses at Auto Nebula is cybersecurity. That's sort of one of the biggest needs with connected devices or connected cars, or cars that are increasingly complex in terms of their own architectures. And as Roger mentioned, I was talking to Harry today. I'd spent some time at General Motors. I did advanced vehicle development and worked on a Cadillac vehicle program, and also worked in OnStar for a few years in their advanced systems development, looking at next generations of OnStar and how people interact with it in cars. And at the time, and this was back in 2006-ish timing. At the time, this was when turn-by-turn navigation was coming out, and off-board services, things like being able to unlock your car with your phone, or being able to do what we called at the time remote vehicle slowdown. And these are connected vehicle activities.
I don't know if everybody's familiar with the remote vehicle slowdown, and
So-
you reminded me that was from 2007.
Yeah.
And so this is now a feature that only 2 car companies offer in the world. GM and actually Hyundai has this as well, whereby if your GM vehicle is stolen, you have OnStar and you're subscribing, you can report it to the police. The police have to be involved, have to have the vehicle in sight, and they can be given control of the car and have it brought over to the side of the road.
Really?
It's really kind of an amazing thing. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it's kind of a big deal.
It was really cool testing it, because we basically had a guy in a truck with a laptop that could interface with the ECUs in the car through the telematics box. I don't want to dive too much into how it works. But with the push of a button, you could be driving along and have all of a sudden the vehicle die, and it drifts to a stop. And we put some voice prompts behind it, something like, your vehicle is being slowed down. Please remain.
I think we call that the voice of God.
Ha ha ha. Something like that. Yeah. And but it was really eye-opening that I would hop into an SUV with the OnStar executives and say, all right, I want you to go down this test track as fast as you possibly can, because we're going to stop you before you hit the end of it. And when you tell a bunch of car guys this, they view it as a challenge. And they did. So we're careening down the test tracks at about 80 miles an hour and shut down the car. And you know what? It worked.
And you're here to tell the tale, right?
I am, yes.
Well, the funny thing is that one of the sort of milestones in this conversation was the 60 Minutes episode, where the car was sort of pre-hacked And I still think it was Leslie Stahl, but I'm not sure. I don't know why Leslie's always the canary in the coal mine, but they were like frightening her because she's hitting the gas and the car is coming to a stop, right? You know what I'm talking about. But it's a similar proposition, only it was a hack, not a feature. So we went from a feature to the risk of a hack.
Well, I think, it's looking at the hacks that we see on YouTube or the Prius hack, where they basically have to dismantle the dash of the vehicle and interface with one of the controller units somewhere. It shows the complexity involved in actually doing something like that.
Yeah, but they didn't have to take the dashboard apart. We know that now, right?
That's true. And what the concerning thing is moving forward with vehicle-to-vehicle communication or with remote vehicle software updates or with 5G going into cars or with connected infrastructure or, the list goes on. This begins to make it more and more probable that we can hack them remotely rather than, digging into finding a physical interface on an ECU and plugging something into it.
So we are in Washington, D.C., so it seems that we must address the issue of the role of the government in this conversation, especially since when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, security has been introduced into that conversation. And I have some of my own ideas, but I suspect, Yuval, you have some thoughts. One of my main concerns is, again, my blind leading the blind proposition. We want some guidance from the government, but time and again, with all due respect, our congressional representatives sort of demonstrate a limited grasp of what the issues really are. So what do you think the role for government here is? Because I think we've identified that there is some cause for concern.
So I think I recently read a survey that was conducted among C-level management at different OEMs, around what's the biggest obstacle for a connected vehicle. And there was, the number one obstacle was cybersecurity and privacy. A different question was, what's the, and I don't, remember it word by word, but it was, what's the, most major obstacle for autonomous vehicle? And only 1 or 2% indicated cybersecurity. So, so if you ask me what's the role of the government, I think, if you do a quick analysis of what happened with connected car, we had a technology that matured very quickly. So we had no connected car, and then very soon after we had connected cars with features that users wanted. So you had a very significant pressure both from the car manufacturers and also from the users to get those features on the road.
I'm going to take a little bit of exception. So when GM got started with OnStar 20 years ago and you had automatic crash notification, that was a compelling solution.
Right.
And then this little thing called the smartphone came along,
right.
And all of a sudden the customers were saying, well, why do I need a connection in the car? I've got
that's true, but I mean, all those features of remote slowdown or starting your engine and getting the AC on before you get into the car, the dealer doing remote diagnostics. So,
I'm going to tell you that the value of that vehicle connection is probably worth more to the car company and the dealer.
No, that's fine. That's fine. The point is, I think, is there was a lot of pressure to bring those technologies onto road vehicles, while at the same time, there was no actual work around, no significant work around the security of those technologies. Now, if I now fast forward...
They didn't completely ignore it, but there were some obvious shortcomings.
Sure, and objective ones, because, those organizations were not, built originally to handle, the cybersecurity challenges. And now it's not about, going back and say, hey, why didn't you include cybersecurity? But what we do need to ask ourselves is, with all the excitement around autonomous vehicles, and I'm sharing that excitement. I want to get into the car and just push, drive me to work, and then don't do anything for the rest of the next hour. But what happens when we're doing that advancement in autonomous vehicles, and it will eventually reach maturity to hit the road, but we haven't put much of thought and investment in making sure that autonomous vehicle is secured as...
I'm going to make you answer my question, but I did want to say that Harry has already indicated that it's an organizational issue.
Sure.
So what I hear you describing is how we're putting all the pressure on the telematics guys, the connectivity guys, and at the end of the day, those guys are saying, we can't solve this problem. This is a supply chain, organizational, manufacturing implications, dealer, you know what I mean?
I think it's even broader than that. The threats that we're currently solving are threats that we are aware of and that were well researched in the last 10 years. When you are introducing a new technology like autonomous vehicle, where a car now has, a perception of its environment, has the ability to, control various physical aspects of, of its driving, etc., make decisions, then there's a complete new attack surface that needs to be researched, needs to be understood, and then security measures needs to be researched and matured in order to be there in time when you want to launch that new technology. And I think that's,
But I know that you are very aware that there's already global requirements, regulations for securing vehicles, especially in the UK, for example, that if you don't, that the automaker doesn't see to those things, they could be in a lot of financial jeopardy. Maybe they can't even sell their cars if they can't fulfill the requirements in the UK in particular, but other regions as well. Does that regulatory activity touch what you're doing?
I think they're touching for certain aspects, definitely. If you look at some activities even in the U.S. like Self-Drive Act, etc., then you see that there's definitely requirements put in place as for the cybersecurity, but those requirements are for the point in time where that vehicle will hit the road, right? And what I'm concerned about, and I think we all should be concerned about, is how do we make sure that we're doing the work now to mature something for that point in time, so we would not need to debate of whether we have a mature technology but we cannot put it on the road because it's lacking.
So Harry tells a good story about what one OEM is doing, and I would say GM's a little unusual. They're market leader, they're a thought leader in the area. You have a view across the OEM community. Now, we don't need to name names, but I assume that this sort of compliance, recognition, response, preparation varies from car company to car company. Is that what I'm hearing?
True. So obviously, different OEMs are different in that sense. But I think, we're definitely trying, as a community, we're trying to mitigate some of that, problem, using Auto Isaac, saying, this problem is not unique to a very specific OEM.
Are government regulations helpful in getting the attention of these car companies that they need to change their ways a little bit?
Well, I don't know if I'm able to do the analysis of what eventually resulted in different companies coming together to share information. Some of it was, definitely, the need to say, it's not a problem that we could solve by ourselves, and definitely working with others can have that huge impact on how we are solving that problem. But I think that the involvement.
You're way too polite.
Yeah, but I think, no, but I'm getting to is I do think that the involvement of the government in signaling that this is an important topic that needs to be, properly addressed, by the auto industry has definitely, pushed forward some of the advancement that we see in that field.
Yeah, so I got it. I would agree with that. And I think, so let's go back to the GPAC. That was kind of a similar moment because NHTSA actually required Jeep to issue a recall on all those vehicles. And as you already indicated, it's a pretty expensive endeavor for them. So I think that was really a kind of a moment where everybody in the industry kind of woke up and said, this is really
an OS moment,
really important stuff. I think that NHTSA's enforcement authority is still there. And anytime they feel that there's a threat to safety from a vehicle on the road, they have the ability to go all the way to require the manufacturer to issue a recall. So I think that is already there. I think our concerns with some of these bills that have been introduced that say you have to everybody's cars are going to be evaluated and they're going to be 5 stars and 4 stars and all that. This is a constantly and very dynamic and
you just nailed it, Harry. Exactly. Certifying security. So this was something Balasek and Miller talked about at Black Hat 3 or 4 years ago after their original hack. They said, we're going to create this certification authority and we're going to evaluate every car and every automaker. And then they said, by the way, we have this product that will help secure your car. Like, oh, well, I mean, it was so self-serving, it was ridiculous. But it did raise a question. You know, what does certification look like? Is it even possible to certify? And could it even be misleading? I suspect you have some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's our concern. I think, first of all, it's a very dynamic and changing environment. And so, you know, the day after the car is introduced into the market, it's dealing with an environment that's changed. So whatever it's certified to has changed. So that's certainly one thing.
Is anybody trying to do it today?
I don't think so. I think that
You can have pen testing, but that's about it, right?
yeah, well, we do a lot of pen testing on both inside and outside. We have inside red teams, and we recruit outside red teams to pen test our systems. But you know, one of the concerns is if you manage to get the 5-star rating, you know, that's like putting a bullseye on your vehicle for every
Yeah.
researcher that's out there to say, you know, I've been able to hack this great 5-star vehicle. So, you know, there are a lot of concerns about that and how you could validly put that kind of a system into place. I think, you know, the Self-Drive Act and the AV Start Act, which are concern regulation of self-driving vehicles, which we've talked about, both have specific requirements in them for cybersecurity. And we would be, you know, really the only industry, I think, that I'm aware of that has kind of specific cybersecurity statutory language that we have to live up to if those bills are put into law, which we certainly encourage the Senate to pass the AV Start Act, and hopefully they can conference and we would have a set of rules and regulations that deal with self-driving vehicles that answer some of the questions that have been posed.
But I think we need to make sure, you know, we need to also understand, you know, that either standardization or, you know, call it certification is not necessarily, you know, prescribing a specific implementation. And we could look at other industries, and I think that the philosophical question of whether we need to define where the bar is at is a philosophical question that was already answered in other industries. For instance, if you have you know, a smart card that is being used for your, you know, mobile, for your ID card, then there are common criteria set. It's a standard that says what you need to conform with in terms of your development process and testing process, etc., to make sure you have adequate security when you're putting that smart card out there. It doesn't mean that you need to use that specific technology or you're prescribing a very specific implementation, but you're defining, you know, the bar that you need to reach in order to be able to, you know, market that type of product. And I think that in that sense, the auto industry, you know, is not necessarily, you know, should not necessarily be different than other industries where you do need to set some bar.
Minimum requirements.
Some minimum requirements. And those should not be prescriptive, and I would tend to agree. And meaning, you know, if you've met the 5-star rating, doesn't mean that your car is, you know, impenetratable, right? But it means that you've used the state of the art to ensure that the product that you're putting on the road is as safe as you could, you know, possibly have.
We have to
To jump in, I'll toss it to Faye, but I think that's really what the industry intends the best practices to be.
We have to remember that cybersecurity is an asymmetric emerging threat. So one of the things that we did in aviation, working with our regulator, by the way, who also was struggling with this safety versus security and no cybersecurity regulations per se at that time, was how do we do this? Because we've got to do something, right? And what does that bar look like? And we would have to certify about an aircraft, and that went into functionality and capability. Now, what came out of this is because it is such an emerging threat, we started to recognize, and particularly in Europe, they recognized that they wanted the OEMs to start to do what we call continuing airworthiness certification, meaning that every 6 months or so, Airbus would have to say, here are the threats and vulnerabilities, and here's our architecture is still standing up against that. So it would certify against what was currently known over a period of time that was still good to go. because you're never going to lock it down. That's the key to regulation here. You cannot overregulate this, or all they're going to do is find another way in, right? So I just highly recommend that, as Harry has shared, that we really cautiously approach this and understand that this is not an easily regulated environment. And the other point I wanted to make about government, because your question was about government, so the government also acts as a partner. And I wanted to point that out because a lot of times we just immediately go to the regulatory aspect for obvious reasons. But the government also supports what we call a public-private partnership with industry to support them in trying to thwart the nefarious threat that we have here. And that is through the Department of Homeland Security for non-DOD. And the whole program of an ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, was set up under what we call the National Infrastructure Protection Plan that provides a seat, if you will, at the government table where we can, in fact, gain additional data and information, not only from the government, but the other ISACs. And so that sharing environment is really encouraged. The sharing is not used for any regulatory purposes. The data is not FOIable based on the program the DHS has set up. So I wanted to also give them a shout out because it's a very important program as well.
Well, law enforcement more generally is interested in vehicle connectivity and the potential for hacking. Sometimes law enforcement wants to kind of hack into vehicles. Oh my Lord.
Someone's hacking?
It may or may not be well known that it is possible in some geographies, possibly in the U.S., for automakers to listen in on Bluetooth calls that are taking place over an automotive system under appropriate circumstances and with subpoenas and things like that. Don't want to make anybody paranoid any more than they already are. But Harry, did you have an additional comment to what Faye was saying?
No, I just think it's an excellent point. I mean, I think the DHS and other government agencies are very anxious to partner with industry and to help in this area.
Yeah. And another role that I would maybe identify for the government, and definitely a lot of initiatives like that, is to help early stage companies or very early stage technology mature in a very on a fast track. And we have examples for that in different areas. We've done several projects in the past with Volpe Center, with the DOT in the U.S. In Israel, we've just launched not a long time ago what's called the Smart Range. It's basically government funded, but also private companies fund this, and we as Harman, we were part of the founding members. Creating this environment when somebody wants to research technology around cars, it doesn't need to buy a proving ground and then buy cars, etc., because that would mean that academic institutes and very early stage startups cannot have access to that technology. So instead, helping them mature that technology on a quick track, and I think that's definitely a place where government can take an active role.
Oh, by the way.
So that's actually an interesting point that you make. I think that twofold. One of the things that I do for Auto Nebula is we're launching a program now called what we call Soft Landing, which is really designed, and we might get into more of this, to help bridge the gap internationally. So we're working with international startups to help bring them into the U.S. market and vice versa, so that we can start looking at more of this global issue. So as we're coming up, Harry mentioned that there's a bill in the Senate for AV. There's one that was passed in the House. I think the one in the Senate is still stuck at the moment. But it really starts pointing to this landscape moving forward. It's evolving quickly. It's saying, cars are becoming increasingly sophisticated with sensors. ADAS is growing, and autonomy is on the horizon, if not here, in small, fits and starts as it is now. And moving forward, this starts changing the whole supply chain. It's gone from a largely physical supply chain to now a lot of data-driven services and a lot of algorithmic-driven services. And whether we're tying sensors together
Well,
or
software,
tying cars
as we
together.
said at the very beginning, all that software
Yeah.
code.
And so, how do we start looking at regulatory nuances in the U.S. market versus regulatory nuances in the EU versus Asia versus Israel? And then how do we help early stage companies get a foothold, number one, but then also develop technologies in harmony so that we're actually building something. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. So just the bills, I mean, the FMVSS alone doesn't really have any provisions for automated vehicles at all.
So there are obviously a number of steps in the process of detecting and responding to some kind of an intrusion. So there's detection, there is response, and recovery. Can you walk through that a little bit? Because my sense is detection is one thing. Actually responding is something very different, and it speaks to why we are connecting cars. So we got into a little bit of an exchange on why we're connecting cars, and I would dare say, since we're talking about security really being a process, that vehicle connectivity goes hand in hand with cybersecurity. Someone might say, oh, well, the most secure car would be my 64 Mustang. Well, ideally, the only way we're going to have security is if we have connectivity, because of the need for things like software updates. And interestingly, your office is being merged outside Tel Aviv with Red Band, which is specifically that over-the-air software update technology. So where do we stand today from the process of, we've talked a lot about detection and a little bit about response, but we've talked about response in terms of letting everyone know and maybe having a recall, which is going to be a multi-million-dollar proposition. I think there have been some software update responses already today.
For security patching.
Yeah, so what can you tell us about where we're at in terms of a full-on connected solution?
So I think, today, I would say for most, the detection is done voluntarily, as either somebody saying, okay, I found a vulnerability, or somebody calling a call center and saying, I have a problem with my car, and then somebody starts to
So we don't have
analyze it.
big command control rooms with
So
dashboards?
for most, we
This car in
still don't
Kankakee
have
was
it,
just hacked?
and I think that's definitely a key point where if we assume that there are vulnerabilities that we haven't found, what's our ability to detect in real time on the car itself, using technology that something has happened.
Is any real-time notification happening today from the vehicle, or is it all, crowdsourced kind of?
Yeah, no, I think that's being implemented, and so we have a defense in depth strategy that's not unique to us, but the idea is you have these layers of defense, and that hopefully when you see that an actor is maybe been able to penetrate the first layer of defense, you're able to react before they get down into the actual safety critical systems in the vehicle.
Right, and as part of that defense in depth, you're basically saying, yeah, I want to be able on the car itself to know that something happened, and then to maybe mitigate it locally. But then I want to collect that data. We've talked about data in the context of connected car, but that data is also relevant for security from a security perspective, because gathering that data and being able to do security analytics on multiple cars in different regions, etc., allows you to actually understand what is the problem, and you also have the technology of patching that problem with over-the-air updates. So I think that one of the missing pieces today is how do you bridge that gap between knowing that there is a problem, but because of the complexity of the supply chain, not necessarily knowing what specific vulnerability is the one that needs to be patched. Then you need to take it to your supplier and ask for a patch, and only then, when there's a new software release that is being fully tested and qualified, then only then you could do a software update. So even if you have those two pieces in place, there's still the challenge of how you shorten the path between detection and remediation. And many of the things that we're working on, as a company, is what technology pieces we could put here to replace the human intervention in that process, so we make sure that it's not 3 or 6 months, but it's a matter of days till you are able to properly remediate.
That's a major obstacle in and of itself, but by the nature of the automotive industry. So we've talked about the supply chain, but what are the implications of a complex supply chain? Well, that those codes triggered in that vehicle could imply multiple suppliers interacting, and as you say, you would have to do some significant testing before you could just sort of throw some software together and send it out and call it corrected. Any other thoughts on this challenge for securing vehicles?
Well, you know, when you think of it as a computational environment, cars were analog. You know, it was a bunch of subsystems put together. You know, engines and brakes and, you know, pieces of a car were analogs. They were connected with hoses and they were connected with levers and you know, in older cars, when you push a gas pedal, you know, a rod pulls something in the carburetor and causes, you know, acceleration to happen. And now a lot of these ECUs have found their way into subsystems, taking an analog device and making it a digital device. And it's very crude. It started out very crude. The code could only travel one way. It was very low level. It functioned very simply. It was basically on, off, you know, die, and that was it. And as these were networked together in a car, it sort of organically grew into this strange computational environment that was a little bit disconnected from itself. It didn't really have an operating system. It didn't function in a way where it was fully reliable. You know, all of us see trouble codes triggered, you know, a sensor malfunction somewhere, and then all of a sudden the car doesn't go above 45 miles an hour. And this has happened over the years, and now we're starting to connect cars, and we're starting to integrate infotainment systems into cars to bring in streaming media or off-board services, or now we're looking at remote vehicle updates, and to take this, you know, and GM and Ford and any other legacy automaker probably struggles with, you know, how to take this whole electrical architecture and make it a computational architecture. Whereas somebody like Tesla or Zoox or, you know, another company that's really building a car from the ground up and integrating all of its sensors into a new electrical architecture doesn't face those same legacy hurdles. You know, so they can also control a lot of their supply chain, and they can control their computational environment so that when you update the car, it updates the whole thing. Or it updates, you know, a lot of the deeper subcomponents than you know, the layers and layers of connectivity that are in, you know, more traditional vehicles.
So I would say, at least from our perspective, you know, our cybersecurity organization has involvement with the design and construction of the vehicle from day one today. And there isn't a system that goes into production on our vehicles until the cybersecurity organization has signed off on that. And indeed, we've pulled systems immediately before they were slated for production because the cybersecurity organization said that there was risk there and that they weren't prepared to sign off on it. So, you know, there is we are in a legacy and environment, and that tends to be incremental. But at the same time, you know, we're designing vehicles from the ground up for tomorrow, with all the same challenges but also opportunities that Tesla and others are facing. The self-driving vehicles are built on the Bolt platform, but there's 40% of the content in those vehicles is unique to the self-driving vehicle, including the entire wire harness. So all of the inside wiring in the self-driving vehicle is vastly different from the wiring in a traditional Bolt that's on the market today.
So if you could comment, Harry, on the level of sophistication of the supply chain and how that has evolved, because I think semiconductor companies, they're serving all kinds of industries, so I suspect they're well prepared for this requirement, but maybe some others that are a little bit more dedicated and old school, shall we say, might not be prepared, and all of a sudden there's a new layer of overhead they have to deal with.
Well, I can't really speak from the supply chain side of it, but certainly from our side of it, for some time now, we've incorporated cybersecurity hurdles that we expect our suppliers to meet, and they're open to audit, and there are audits done on cybersecurity through the supply chain. So, you know, we take that into perspective, and we certainly expect our supply chain to live up to those commitments.
Yeah, what I would add to that from a tier one supplier perspective. So at Harman we do two things. One, in our connected car organization, which is basically the tier one supplier of Harman, we've established a few years ago a group that is specialized in security. We have security experts in place, and the role of that organization is not just to inject into each specific program or each specific project, but to lay out a foundation of what we call security development lifecycle. Not just we call it, but the industry call it security development lifecycle, where we basically tapping into the V-shaped model of how you are designing, implementing, testing, and making sure that in all of those activities, there are specific activities around security. So you're going to think about a new system. You're doing a threat analysis and risk assessment, and then you're defining a security objectives that you want to meet, throughout the design of that system, and so on.
So I'm assuming this is where standards come in.
And yeah, definitely. So I think part of the work that we've been doing for many years now, with originally with SAE and then with the joint SAE ISO, and also with Auto Isaac. Harman was one of the first suppliers to join Auto Isaac when it was open to suppliers. Is working as an industry to kind of form best practices on how we should handle security in our processes. In our organization, and it's definitely an organizational challenge, not just a technology challenge. But also aside from that, we're also and kind of tapping into in the platform that Harry was mentioning. There are 40% new components, but there are 60% that we also should consider that are legacy. Meaning that even if we're now as a tier one supplier, providing a new system which is state of the art in terms of security, we should also assume that there are maybe other components and other aspects of the design of the car which are still inheriting from legacy systems. And that's why we've also formed the Automotive Cybersecurity Business Unit within Harman to kind of help and provide technology to the industry to make sure that we have a robust security solution that is not tied to a very specific component, definitely not just to the components that Harman is supplying as a supplier.
So I have a sort of a two-part question I'd like to ask each panel member. And how are we on time?
2 minutes to go.
Okay. So I think we have enough. We started late, so we can go over a little bit. So what do you think the biggest threat risk is for connected cars? And where would you put us on the don't worry, run for the hills, don't get in another car on the spectrum? So what is the biggest threat in your
Am I limited to connected cars or autonomous vehicles?
Well, we're not going to have the FDA conversation about medical devices that are not secure. So let's just talk about cars. Yes.
Yeah, no. I mean cars, but
or vehicles.
Yeah, vehicles. So I think we've definitely made a lot of progress in terms of how we are designing security in place. I think we're still challenging with what's our ability to respond very quickly to an incident, and that's something that I think we all should be concerned of.
Biggest threat.
Yeah.
Connected vehicles.
It's a threat because it means
No.
that.
What is the biggest threat? Is it identity theft? Is it remote control? Is it ransomware? What is your thought on that?
Well, I would say that as cars become more and more cyber physical systems, then I would tend to say that the safety threat is the one that we should be more concerned about. Although obviously there's more and more data collected
Safe
on
operation
the car.
of the car.
Yeah, safe
Not
operation of the
compromising.
car.
Not compromising that. And where are we? Don't worry and never get in a car again.
Well, we all own cars, so I don't think it's realistic in saying don't get into a car unless you buy an old car running carburetors and you don't worry in that case. I think we should we should definitely take that seriously. Meaning that we should not say cars are safe, cars are secured. There's still a lot of challenge ahead of us, and that challenge is only growing when you're introducing autonomous vehicles.
Sounds like we're leaning towards don't worry, but be aware.
Towards be concerned, but still own a car. Okay.
Okay. Faye, your thoughts on the biggest threat and where we are on the spectrum.
So I think there's a couple of things that are looming right now that we're looking at. Clearly, there's car theft, simple as that, right? So really, if you want to look at what's been happening, that's a lot of reasons why people go after a car, to steal them, right? It's still happening. I think the other thing is privacy. So we're all pairing our iPhones with our car. So when we get out of a rental car or we sell our car, do we remember to take that off? So you might have the security of your own personal information.
No, that was, by the way, speaking of which, and that's a great point, is AutoISAC defining some sort of guidelines about how, when you automatically deleting all that personal information?
Well, we're talking about it. Actually, we talked about perhaps privacy by design best practice guide, so we're considering that.
Yep.
Thank
And GDPR is also
And GDPR is out
also
there now. and-
there.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, so on the spectrum, no problem,
No,
be
I
very
think
afraid.
we have to be alert, vigilant, always be responsible and actively engaged.
Somewhere in the middle, okay.
Yeah.
Harry?
Yeah, so I think from an OEM, I mean, the perspective that where your brand is really at stake is safety. And, if your product is perceived by the public not to be a safe product, and, that's a very serious concern. So safety is our top priority for sure. I think that I'll make 2 points of it. I think obviously we place very high up in our organization. We pay a lot of attention to, and we wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't a concern. So, there's something to be concerned, something to be aware of. But on the other hand, I would say that there is a lot of organization and money and efforts being put up against that to mitigate that. I think as members of the public, we need to be aware of how we deal with our automobiles. We shouldn't be picking up USB sticks out in the parking lot and sticking them into the USB port in the car. We shouldn't. We should be very aware of what gets put into the USB port or the data port that's in every vehicle, required to be there by law. So I think these are things that
Oh, you're talking about the OBD2.
the OBD2 port, yeah. Those are things that I think everybody should think about.
Okay, now you raised it. It seems to me every time I hear a story about OBD2s, I hear this, that GM has some specific sort of challenges interacting with those devices. Does GM actively try to block some of the functionality of those devices, or how do you cope with them? Every automaker has to have a strategy for coping with people
Well, I
sticking
mean,
those
so
things in.
OBD2 port is a port that a data port we're required to have into the vehicle. I think that
They're not going away, as far as I can tell.
no, they're not going to go away, and certain information has to be presented to that data port. I think that going forward, what you'll see, not today maybe, but in the future, you'll see limitations so that just the data that is required legally to be there is there, and you don't have full access to the CAN bus through the port.
People
That
are
kind of.
always going to hack through with whatever firewall you put in there, don't you think?
Well, I think that's certainly one of the layers of defense that you put there, and you know that people are there is no foolproof defense, and so you put a lot of layers in there, and you hope and make every effort to detect any activity before it threatens the safety of your product.
So don't worry, be terrified.
I'd say it's something like I think it's something to be aware of, and I think but I think that the products are safe, and if they weren't, you'd be hearing about that.
Jeremy, you get the final word until maybe one or two questions before we close out.
All right. Well, I think as far as cybersecurity goes, the biggest threat to me is safety and safe operation of cars, or ultimately safe operation of fleets. As we move into a more and more connected environment and an autonomous environment, and cars that are ultimately connected with infrastructure, and I know the Wilson Center teaches this too, is you're only as secure as the weakest link in your chain. So I can hack into an ECU or hack into the OBD2 port or the USB port, or maybe I can hack into a street lamp and just send malware to a car remotely.
Or you could interfere with vehicle sensors.
Potentially, yeah. And so as this moves forward, I think the opportunities to interface with cars are just going to grow, in terms of complexity and in terms of medium. So
I'm getting frightened.
no, don't be frightened. I guess I'm also an eternal optimist about this, and I work with startup companies, so this is actually kind of exciting. But I think that much like phones have experienced vulnerabilities in connectivity, these are just small devices, but look where they've come in the past 10 years, and look how ubiquitous they are in our lives. We still use them, even though we can be hacked in open, Wi-Fi networks pretty much everywhere, or somebody walking past that can interface with Bluetooth or RFID or, other ways to get into your phones. But, we still use them, and we still develop and use them actually increasingly for every aspect of our lives. Same thing is true with a car. It's just that it weighs a lot more and it's a lot bigger and it has a whole lot more computers than a phone does.
Might be a little bit more complicated to hack or take advantage of than a phone, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, it is. And so I think ultimately what it comes down to is, data privacy is a concern, functionality is a concern. People are hacking cars now to be able to improve performance or customize them. I think this is going to continue, and this is, it's definitely going to continue. There are a lot of tinkerers out there who will play with these. I think the biggest threat is safety threats. And I think those are the ones that we have to be conscious of.
Okay, well, I think we're agreed. Okay, 2 questions, and you got your hand up first. Hey, good to see you again.
Oh, thank you. Bill Gauss says, hey, thanks for the plug. Quick comment first. I would suggest that the EPA enforcement group in this country is probably as tenacious and persistent as Mossad. So please clarify that you did that tinkering while you were in Israel. But my question is, we talked a lot, and Harry, your comments were quite insightful. We talked about the spectrum of whatnot. Is there an additional responsibility going on the consumer? Because traditionally recall rates are kind of lame in this country. They're never 100%, no matter what. And it sounds like it's really vitally important, not just for me to hit, update security, but because I'm driving a car, I'm endangering others too. So the priority of that is pretty high. How's that being looked at from a policy, education, all perspectives?
Yes, I think that's a great point. There have been a lot of discussions, and I think Faye can talk about this. I think there have been a lot of discussions about public education and what we can do. There are some websites that are there that talk about cyber hygiene from an automobile perspective that people can go to. I think in terms of making sure that your vehicle is not subject to a recall, NHTSA has a website very easily accessible where you can put the VIN of your vehicle into it, and it will tell you whatever recalls are effective for that vehicle. And I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to be aware of that and to try to make sure that we do everything, to protect our investment. And vehicles are a major investment. So, the lifespan of a vehicle is 11 years, between 11 and 12 years that people have vehicles once they come out of the plant that they're on the road. So, they're out there for a substantial amount of time. And as owners of these vehicles, just like making sure that the tires are fresh and that the engine is tuned, we need to pay attention to the other systems in the vehicle as well.
In that regard, Jeremy mentioned to me data I actually hadn't seen. What we think it was 2017, 1.7 million vehicles recalled for cybersecurity vulnerability.
I think so. So that's my citable statistic. I got that off NHTSA's website. I think to date, as of, I believe it was 2017, there have been 1.7 million vehicle recalls because of hacks or cybersecurity issues.
Likely to get worse.
I'm sure.
But highlights, I think, the importance of having, the ability to remotely to do software updates remotely instead of doing this, costly act of, recalling car.
But to the earlier point, it's not like, oh, we got a problem, and you press a button.
Sure.
One more question. Uh-oh. Who gets the last one? You want to choose? Well, you're closest. Okay. So
Yeah, thank you for that. My name's Steve Moore. I'm with the Southwest Business Improvement District here in D.C. We're working on a pilot for driverless vehicles here in the spring. And we've been interviewing the manufacturers of sort of low-speed urban shuttles. And at some point, we'll have to bring forward our plan to what here in D.C. is called the Special Events Task Force. And I'm thinking about the conversation we're just having now. There will be no comfort at the Special Events Task Force for the idea that these vehicles are secure. And you can see when events or protests or even farmers markets now are staged around the DC, there's Jersey barriers and tanks and all sorts of other stuff. My concern is if we don't get over this initial sort of let's test vehicles, let's watch them operate up and down 10th Street, we'll never get to kind of a phased deployment of these over time. And a little bit like what you're saying is our sense, the planning group's sense is that this is really happening very, very quickly. My question really is, do you have any thoughts or guidance for those of us that are kind of on the ground looking to begin to think through pilot programs, early phases for deployment, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so just from our perspective, so this is, I mean, for an industry that for 100 years has been built, as we've discussed on the idea of a gasoline combustion engine in a vehicle owned by an individual and driven by an individual, and all of that is changing simultaneously, and that's a lot of change for an industry. On the other hand, we have to think in terms of the totality of where we are on this spectrum. So, today GM is testing a fleet of about 180 vehicles in 3 different parts of the country. We see the early deployments of these vehicles very similar to what you outlined, geofenced areas in dense urban areas where the vehicles can provide ride sharing or public transit options that don't exist today. And so we want to work with the folks on the ground in the communities that we want to try to deploy in. But I think we have to understand, first of all, that all these deployments, the early deployments will be very limited, and there'll be learning experiences for the OEMs as well as for the folks in the communities. And I think we all sense that this technology has the capacity to be truly transformative. But, in terms of a fleet of over 230 million vehicles on the road in the United States today, I mean, it's going to be a long time before you start this, we all wake up and all the vehicles driving around out there are going to be self-driving vehicles.
Yeah, a little further context. I've run into governmental authorities and even some sort of private, like I was talking to someone from the Florida Chamber of Commerce who was talking about, come and test your vehicles in Florida. There are no limitations. There are no regulations because we want to get as many human beings away from driving vehicles as we possibly can because we have a disproportionate number of highway fatalities, because we have a disproportionate number of tourists and older drivers that we'd love to see in automated vehicles. So basically, Florida, maybe to some extent, like Arizona, has no regulation. They're just saying, come on down. So as Harry said, these developments are happening sort of simultaneously, but there is legislative connective tissue around the Self-Drive Act, et cetera, to that there's a recognition that cybersecurity is a more important concern if you're talking about autonomous operation.
Roger.
Yeah, Jeremy.
No, mine. I got, developments like this that are going to be a combination of vehicles, probably plus some infrastructure that you're going to want to connect with, is be conscious of it, but include security as part of the RFP. There have been deployments of connected infrastructure out in the field today, and it's we want to see if this is going to work. And we want people to come and test it and discover how well it works or how poorly it works because we want to use this as a research tool. But a lot of these many early efforts for connected infrastructure they don't have a stitch of security on them because it was never included in the RFP. And so adding this to the RFP, who's going to do it and why? So it's, there I'm not going to name where, but there's miles and miles and miles of connected roadways out there that have no security. So if you're a hacker, go for it. But so include it as part of a.
Well, and to your point, it's an unanswered question for the V2V DSRC kind of mandate, the secure credential management system. They still haven't figured out who's that going to be, and they sort of have some idea what it's going to look like, but the who is not really sorted out yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me thank Yuval, Faye, Harry, and Jeremy for their insights today, and thank you for your attention.